Dear friends, welcome to another edition of the Forum 2000 online chat, where we discuss the future of freedom and democracy in the current complicated times. Today we have the pleasure of speaking to Richard Youngs, who is a Senior Fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governments program at the Carnegie Europe, and also Professor of International Relations at the University of Warwick. Together we will discuss the future of civic activism, how civic activism is being affected by the pandemic, and what can we expect as we go on. Thank you for being with us, Richard, and welcome to the Forum 2000 online chat.
Hi, hello.
So, Richard, has the global lockdown limited the civic activism in the world, and has it affected it negatively?
Well, at one level, clearly the virus, the pandemic is not good news for civic activism, for civil society around the world. I think the reasons for that, we all know. The focus has been on government responses to the emergency. That has involved many restrictions on civil society. Many of these restrictions are necessary, they're justifiable, they're probably unavoidable. But we also know at the same time that many governments are taking advantage of the health emergency to smuggle in restrictions for more questionable and more political motives. We all know these restrictions against civil society have been happening for the best part of a decade now in authoritarian regimes, but also in many democratic countries as well. So this is a global phenomenon, and one must be worried that the virus is going to accelerate, is going to intensify this trend that we've been witnessing over the last several years. But that is one part of the story. The other part of the story is about more effort, more dynamism emerging within civil society around the world. This is also a trend we've seen emerging over the last few years. And the significant thing is that the virus is also acting as an additional catalyst to these new forms of civic activism. That is not to say that the virus is in any way good news for civil society, but it does mean that the overall picture is a little bit more complicated than simply referring to this narrative that the virus is good news for authoritarians and bad news for anyone interested in democracy. So interestingly, in Carnegie, we've been running a network from around the world involving scholars and activists from very, very diverse sets of countries. And they've been reporting back to us that in many ways, the virus has kind of given a jolt of new energy to civil society in many different ways. In some senses, we're seeing the emergence of new kinds of civic initiatives trying to help out on the health emergency. We're also seeing more traditional existing organizations change the nature of their activities so that they become more relevant to the kind of priorities countries are facing in the middle of the pandemic. And we're seeing an intensification of NGOs, CSOs working in the area of misinformation as well. We know that there has been a dramatic increase in misinformation operations during the virus, and that has created a kind of backlash amongst civic activists to try and limit the damage caused by that trend. So for me, the overall message is there are mixed trends. In many ways, the virus is bad news for democracy and human rights activists, but in many ways we see a kind of new civic spirit or civic ethos being generated as a result of the crisis in many countries.
Can you give us a concrete example of a positive civic society activity or civic society organization changing in a positive way due to this development?
Yes, I mean, we've from in our network, we've heard from um, civil society organizations that were slightly on the back foot, say Tunisian human rights organizations, organizations in Iran, for example, that have been facing very, very severe contexts in recent years, repurposing their activities, gaining a wider degree of buy-in from societies and moving to organize more effectively to help during the emergency, but also seemingly be able to create a little bit more space for their activities. We've even seen this in the most difficult of circumstances, for example, in Syria, where even in the midst of an ongoing conflict, we've seen many organizations move up a gear and change the focus of their activities to blend in their work with the priorities that obviously facing society as a result of the pandemic. In Brazil, we know the very sensitive political debates around the government's response or lack thereof to the pandemic, but this in turn has galvanized many interesting new civic initiatives, many of these rooted in local communities, quite poor communities, trying to mobilize societies to provide protection against the pandemic in a context where we know that many people feel the government is not responding with sufficient magnitude to the crisis. I could give many more examples of the same kind. Many of these initiatives are small scale. There are many of them. They don't necessarily denote a major upgrade in civil society in these countries, but nevertheless, they do show that at many levels, at a local level in particular, people are organizing, and they're organizing with quite a degree of effectiveness as a result of the pandemic.
On the other hand, you mentioned it in your first response a little bit, but what do you see as the main threats, as the main challenges that may come out from this crisis to civil society organization and to civic activism?
Well, I think there's the most obvious danger that regimes will take advantage of the restrictive measures they have introduced in order to facilitate their management of the crisis, and that those restrictions will stay in place for too long a period of time. And it's actually very difficult to decipher the differences between civic restrictions that are strictly necessary in the crisis and those measures that are likely to not be justified over a longer time for more political reasons. So I think we need to be very, very attentive to that most obvious danger. But I think there are more subtle or second order dangers as well. In particular, we pick up from around the world a concern that because civil society now is working in such a focused way on dealing with the pandemic, on trying to help out, providing immediate humanitarian assistance, some of the longer term work focused on human rights, on democratic reform, could suffer as a result of that. So clearly it's necessary for civil society to be playing an active role in the health emergency, but over the longer term, this should not be to the detriment, or it would be very costly if this were to the detriment of civil society's more traditional political activities. And then another second order issue is that there is a slight danger that the crisis will create a deeper sense of polarization in many countries. And this polarization may start off as a very political form of polarization, but it may filter down into civil society and create new divisions between different parts of civil society within particular countries. India would be an example where we see this is an incipient risk. So even in national contexts where the virus seems to be catalyzing a new wave of civic activism, there is a danger that this could feed into and compound the kind of political polarization that the virus is creating in at least some countries.
It's obvious, but one of the key issues for all of the civil society organizations around the world is funding. What's your expectations in this regard? Because we, I think, can very reasonably expect a large recession, large economic crisis. What consequences in terms of funding will this have?
So, I mean, this is a very real danger. In the Carnegie paper we recently wrote on this topic, we refer to this as the kind of longer term second order danger. And there is a very real risk of funding drying up for civil society as a result of the recession. However, one trend among civil society organizations in recent years is that many of them have begun to realize that they need to search for alternative source of funding anyway, that international funding has been decreasing. We know it's been increasingly difficult for international funders to get money to many civil society organizations already for many years because of restrictive NGO laws. So there has been some interesting thinking amongst many parts of the civil society community about how CSOs can begin generating their own resources, changing their own business models in order to compensate for the potential drying up of traditional sources of funding. So, I mean, international funding, I mean, we would argue, needs to be kept at a reasonable level, even during the crunch that will come as a result of the crisis. But the virus may be an additional factor amongst the many factors that already exist, pushing civil society organizations in the direction of trying to raise their own funds, provide services, and generate their own resources. So that's, in a way, not a completely new challenge faced by civil society organizations. It's one they've already been grappling with for several years, and that the virus is likely simply to make more of a challenge.
So what is your expectation of civil society after the pandemic cedes? What do you think will be the major changes in comparison with the previous situation?
I think there'll be there will be a legacy of tighter restrictions on many types of civic activism. So many parts of civil society will come out of the crisis facing a more challenging environment. But at the same time, I think there will be more vibrant forms of activism taking place within communities, perhaps around a new set of policy priorities. This will be a very real and dynamic form of civil society, but it may look slightly different from the global civil society we had going into the virus. I don't think ultimately the impact of the virus will be apparent in the short term. I think this will take several years for the ramifications of the crisis to filter through completely. I think we'll see a period of quite some fluidity where the politics of the crisis are being played out within civil society itself. So I think we'll come out of the virus with these opposing dynamics. One, a very kind of top-down technocratic form of government that regimes are keen to use and justify as a result of the virus, and then pushing back against that, a much more bottom-up form of politics that is appearing because many citizens are frustrated about the inefficiency of their governments in the management of the crisis. And it's that mismanagement of the crisis that we're seeing in many countries that will act as a kind of reinforcing catalyst for civic activism within established democracies and within less democratic countries as well.
In conclusion, what would be your one recommendation for CSOs after the COVID pandemic?
I think they need to somehow harness this new set of concerns and energy that are coming from a very kind of locally rooted community basis, and marry that with the more traditional political focus that many parts of civil society have had, and in particular those parts of civil society working most overtly or directly on democracy, might consider how they can try and use this new realm of civic activism to benefit their own political activities. And that will require some reprogramming, some rethinking in terms of the way that part of civil society is traditionally operated. There will be new dangers for those kind of civic actors coming out of the crisis, but potentially at least new opportunities as well, if those civil society organizations know how to seize those opportunities.
Well, Richard, this has been tremendously interesting. Thank you very much for your insights, and I hope to be able to welcome you in Prague in October.
Thank you, JAKUB. Good talking to you. Thanks.